Hi, my name is Matthew Bellisario. Thank you for coming by the BellisarioSonic YouTube channel from the heart of the Deep South on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, where we talk about music, records, do record reviews, and interviews, which I've been dropping on Sundays. Today, I'm bringing you a very, very special interview with one of my favorite musicians, favorite drummers, Simon Phillips. For those of you who watch this channel know I'm a big fan of his, and also hopefully you saw the reviews that I did of this awesome Darwin record and the Protocol 5 record. If you missed that, go back and check those out. What you're going to find out is when I was doing those reviews, I was just blown away by the sound quality. And I was like, these sound like analog recordings. So Simon was kind enough to come on the channel and spend some time talking about his experience as a producer, as a mixing engineer, as a studio engineer, and answering the question, how do you get a digital recording to sound analog? So I bring you the interview with the legend Simon Phillips called The Vinyl Process. All right. Well, we have Simon Phillips with us here today. I'm very grateful to have him on the channel to talk about something a little bit different. I will do just a brief introduction, even though, Simon, you don't need one. You're a legend, but you've been making records for a long time, I think since around 1976. And of course, you play with many bands in the live setting and in the studio. Mike Oldfield, Gary Moore, Asia, Jeff Beck, Pete Townsend, Joe Satriani, John Anderson, Michael Schenker, I think you're on his first record, Hiromi, Toto, Steve Hackett, the list goes on. Also your new projects, your Protocol projects, your Darwin project, Sharini and Phillips, all these modern projects are absolutely fantastic, which I'm really interested in discussing with you. So everybody out there knows you as being a fantastic drummer, a wonderful musician, but they may not know about your ability or your work as a producer, an engineer, and a mixing engineer, because I noticed on a lot of these records you are mixing them. So you have an incredible talent for making these new records, which I'm assuming are made mostly with digital recording, but they sound very analog. They sound very warm, and that is, I listen to a lot of records, and yours sound the best with this kind of music, because a lot of those new recordings a lot of times sound muddy. Yours sound very clean but very warm. So we're going to discuss today the vinyl process, which I'm just excited to have you on here to discuss this.
Great, fantastic. Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit about your first exposure to the production side of things, your engineering side of things, because going into the studio with these people in the 70s, 76, 78, Gary Moore, these different, when did you first start getting interested in that production side, engineering side?
Way before that, actually. But in terms of just watching what was going on. So I grew up in a very musical family. My father was a band leader, Dixieland dance band, and I was dragged around all the London BBC studios from 5 or 6 years old. So I got used to sitting in a chair behind the drummer at a very young age and told not to make a sound, where in an era, just this, let's say mid-60s, let's say 64, 65, where BBC studio recording was very, very corporate, very, very straight, Everybody wore a tie and a blazer. Most of the microphones were ribbon mics. They were mostly STC 4038s, which we know now as Coles. But the BBC designed the microphone, and STC were the manufacturer that actually made it. And there were a few other ribbon mics around, but that was the one I remember most. The red light, the big clock up on the wall, but I think what's most poignant is the control room. The control room was tiny. It had one speaker cabinet in it, because in those days BBC was transmitting AM, which is mono, obviously, and So you only needed one speaker. You had a full track quarter-inch machine, which meant the whole quarter-inch of that tape was going one way, and a well, it wasn't a small console because everything was much bigger in those days. It did have faders. We had the rotary knobs were a little bit earlier. We'd got used to having faders, but they were very old-fashioned faders. Some, the ones at EMI, kind of were like curves. You know, it was like this, like driving a train, really. So, and in this control room, you would have the engineer, you would have a tape op, who in America is called assistant engineer, but in England they weren't given such a grand name. And you'd have the producer, and then the only other people allowed in the control room were the artist, which was my dad. If there was a singer, the singer, and usually the trumpet player, because he was considered the leader of the band apart from my father. Everybody else had to stand outside the room with the door open. And they used to get such great balances. We didn't call them mixing in those days. We called them balancing. And those engineers, I mean, I don't know how technical I'm allowed to get, but a ribbon mic is basically a figure of eight, which means it picks up both sides. Both sides of the microphone are live. So to record 5 brass, which was baritone, tenor, alto, sitting on one side, and on the opposite side was trumpet and trombone, they'd have 2 microphones, just in the middle. So the 3 saxes would get picked up by one side of these 2 ribbons, and the trumpet and the trombone would get picked up by the other side. And I always remember before they would start actually recording, they would do a build-up chord of all the horns to check the balance. And sometimes my dad would actually go into the control room to make sure, sorry about that, don't know how to switch that off actually. In fact, I think I can. Hang on one sec, let's do this. That will become annoying. All right, yes, he would be in the control room to make sure the balance is right. And they'd start with, I think it was the trombone, ba, baritone, ba, tenor, da, alto, ba, and trumpet, dee, right? And the engineer would go, or my dad would go, hey, Stan, trumpet player, Stan Roderick, could you move your chair back a couple of inches, a bit loud, right? Or the alto player, hey Ronnie, could you move your chair in a little bit? So you have to move the music stand and the chair to get the balance. That's how you balanced horns in those days. Drum kit, 1 STC over the top, probably an AKG D25 on the kick drum. Remember the kick drum had a front head on those days. Upright bass, 1 mic. Piano, 1 mic. Banjo, 1 mic. Clarinet, 1 mic. That was it. And it sounded so good. That's the thing. They were so used to recording in mono and balancing, because that's what an engineer basically did. He sorted out his gain structure and very little EQ, if any. I didn't know enough. I was too young. I didn't know enough about the console in those days. But my guess is probably minimal EQ, if anything. The tape machine kind of sorted out a lot of the bottom end problems. So that's just the way it was. And that was it. So I was always fascinated by that. My mum got into recording, and she had a tape recorder. I believe it was a Grundig, and then it was a Ferrograph. And I remember sitting next to it when John Glenn was doing his 3 orbits of the Earth, because she was recording it. And she taught me how to operate the machine. And she told me, never press that button. That's the one with the little red circle in it, which is the erase button or the record button. But she taught me how to, thread a piece of tape through the head block, through the capstan and the rollers. And she showed me what happened when you twist the tape. It plays the backside of the tape and everything sounds really muffled, you know. And I was probably only, John Glenn, what was that, 60 or 61?
I don't recall exactly what year.
Yeah, memory. I think it was
61.
61, but I may be wrong. I was 4 years old, I think. But I was learning how to play with a tape machine. I was fascinated by it. And all through my childhood, I would play with her. She eventually got two Revox G36s, which are tube tape machines, one high speed, one lower speed, and they were stereo. So I used to bounce between, two machines, playing a little shaker or drums or a bit of piano, whatever. So really, as a kid, I was already into sound, and like everybody our age, buying records. And I used to play along to records, but there were certain things about these records that stuck out to me. Certain records that just sounded so great. And they were the ones I tended to play more to because I just loved the way they sounded. I remember later on, probably when I was 12 or 13, there was this one Shirley Bassey record. Now, I wasn't particularly at that stage interested in Shirley Bassey. She was a household name in those days, and her voice, of course, through the James Bond movies and all the hits she had in England, a very recognizable voice. But what I remember about this record, and there was a full band, maybe even some strings on it. The sound of this record was just gorgeous. So I bought it only because of the sound. Wasn't really that interested in the style of music. It was a bit square for me, But I love the sound. Some of those Creed Taylor records, some of them sounded great. Some of them didn't sound that great. I thought, oh, so that's my background in terms of getting into sound. I started doing sessions with my dad. I joined his band when I was 12. First session I did, I was 13. So I was in a BBC studio with that Coles mic on top of my drum kit and that D25. And by then I think they'd added a KM64 Neumann on the snare drum. And I was at still mono. So my first sessions were mono, which is very unusual in 1971.
Right.
To be doing sessions still in mono. So in a way, I was really lucky to get that experience. I mean, most people, even older than me, never recorded a mono session. By the time they went to the studio, it was already stereo. And then, but my first record with him was in 1972. I did another one in 1973. So you say 76, actually, I was already doing sessions. And in 1973, I started doing proper sessions. After my dad passed away, suddenly I was a kid in town playing in a theater, Jesus Christ Superstar, and people were asking me to play on sessions. So it was a passion and a hobby as well as a profession.
So you got into that just at the same time you were starting your recording career. You're already interested in all that.
Yeah.
What about when you what you talked about a couple of those records? Can you give us a couple more records that you really like the sound of, and then kind of talk to us about your role, like when it comes to like producing a record? And I noticed that even pretty far back, like with this Crises, that you were already kind of co-producing, right, with on some of these records, maybe before that as well. So can you tell us a little bit about your favorite records and then kind of getting into the production side of things?
Sure. I think a couple of other records. There was a Count Basie record that my mum had, which sounded beautiful in terms of big band. There was a Quincy Jones record called Smackwater Jack, which I absolutely loved. There was a Canadian trombone group, and I have no idea, I can't remember, but I had this record. I don't even know how I got this record, but somehow it ended up at our house, and I played it, and I loved this record because I think it was 3 or 4 trombones and rhythm section. It was a Canadian guy, Canadian artist. I have no idea what his name was, but I love this record because the sound, I love trombone for a start, but the sound of the record was just glorious. And the music was pretty cool too. Harmonically was very interesting. So those are some of the records I remember. I remember Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick, which was recorded by Robin Black. And when I listened to that record many, many years later, especially on Heaven, I realized how amazing the mix was. And that was before computer mix. And that was in the days where all hands on deck, and you used to do sections. And that's actually, in later years, that's how I learned to do it. But you would do like if you were doing a plain pop song, you would say, let's do all the choruses, lay them down onto quarter inch or half inch, depending what era we're in.
Oh, really? Okay.
Then you go back to the verses, lay those down, and then intro, and then you just spend, an hour or so, maybe less, editing it all together. You have to keep very good records, which
Right.
verse is which.
Yeah.
But you do it in order, if you can. Um, and basically, all the faders we used to put tape with, I used to put colored markers. So those colored markers would, let's say, blue would be all verse, red would be chorus. And I'd move all the faders, and then I'd make some notes. There might be some reverb, send. The sends would usually stay the same unless you wanted a special effect. Um, if you were paralleling channels, which means you had a 24 track machine, and before computer mixing, we had actually 24 tracks. We didn't used to lose one on the track for SMPTE code, or EBU, depending where you are. And sometimes, let's say tracks 13 and 14, you used to mix tracks a lot. If you could see which of course I lost, sadly, my original tracks sheet for Crises, the Mike Oldfield album. I mean, it's really long because it's one piece of music. It's 20 minutes long.
It's incredible. Yeah.
Not all those tracks remain like kick drum. Doesn't always stay being a kick drum. Acoustic guitar, which may be panned, or let's say, make this simpler. Piano, which is two tracks panned left and right, let's say on channels 13 and 14. But sometimes you need that channel. So suddenly channel 13 is a banjo, but it needs to be panned in the middle, right? So what we would do is using the patch bay, parallel up channel 13, which is track 13, to maybe channel 26, which might be free. And then you just mute it there, and you unmute that button there, and it's the EQ's all done, reverb center's all done, positioning is all done. And then when he's finished playing, you mute it and unmute your left side to the piano, which might now be the left side of the strings.
Wow. Yeah.
This is all about organization. You try to keep a left and right, always a left and right. Piano, organ, strings, whatever the stereo is. In those days, we didn't have too many instruments that were actually stereo, funnily enough. A lot of synthesizers were mono. So you would create stereo using outboard equipment. So those are the type of things going on in those days. And moving along so I was really into this, and I used to sit in on any mixing session I could, just sit at the back and watch. And even a recording session, I'd go in there. I'd actually get to the studio as early as I could, if I wasn't coming from another studio, set up my kit, and then go in and watch the maintenance engineer align the tape machine. Because I wanted to understand what that was all about, And he'd start off with his 1 kilohertz, which is, I used to be able to do it, but we don't hear that tone anymore. Well, not often. Maybe that's 1K, something like that.
Yeah.
And he'd align all the 24 tracks, and then he'd go to 10K, and he'd do his high frequency, and then, of course, his low frequency, which he'd have to record. In Europe, it's 50 hertz. In the States, it's 60 hertz. So I was starting to get the idea of how the tape machine works and alignment, batches of tape, but I wasn't there yet. I was just watching and trying to understand, and then watching the engineers like crazy, watching all the little things they would do, little, outboard bits of equipment they would use. And then I turned up to a recording session with Mike Oldfield. We did a week of tracking on Crises with another engineer. But he obviously saw that I was quite aware of the technical side, because I was very interested in his Fairlight that he was using and all his machines and stuff. I just look at like this Ampex, ATR, ATR 100, I think it is, half-inch machine, which is a stereo machine, and his He had an Ampex ATR 124, 2-inch machine, and a Neve 8108. And he called me a week or two later and said, well, what are you up to? I said, well, I'm doing this and that, and actually I've just started producing an artist, and this artist was called Duncan Brown, which I did quite a few records with. And he said, oh, you produce? And I said, well, I'm just starting, really. He said, how would you like to come and produce me? I was like, uh,
Be right
sure,
there.
yeah, lovely. So we set up a trial week just to see how we'd get on, working obviously much closer together, and you know. So I thought, right, he's got a Neve console. I better get an engineer that's a Neve engineer, who understands a Neve console. So I called Air Studios, which were all Neves in those days, and I found, I don't remember his name, sadly, but he was Scottish. Anyway, we both turned up, and we started working on this one song, which I had played on, but Mike had already added a few different things. And so we did the first day. Most of it was just kind of figuring out what we wanted to keep and what we wanted to scrap. Mike was very good at doing that. And I said, no, let's get rid of those. I don't like those. Don't like that. And we ended up with drum kit and voice, which was Roger Chapman. And he wanted to replace everything that he'd done. He wasn't happy with it. We got to the end of the day, and I went home, and I went to the hotel, actually, and I went, wow, well, this is going to be interesting and quite tough. I turn up the next day, no engineer. I said to Mike, where's, I can't remember his name, Scottish man. He said, oh, I fired him. Oh, really? Yeah, we don't need him. I didn't get on with him. Which, Mike, I would understand. And I went, oh. And then he left the room. I'm like sitting there, the console's right in front of me, tape machines behind me, and I'm going, yikes. And he comes in with a 3-inch thick Neve manual, plonks it on the table. He says, I'll be back in a few hours. Read that. And I went, oh my God, this is, oh shit. Oh no. And I'm trying to, and this was the first digital routing console. So in the normal desk in those days was you have a fader at the bottom, and then you usually had a pan pot, and if it was an inline desk you had a potentiometer, which was the tape machine playing back. If it wasn't a split console, which you used to have, by the way, all the tape machine returns would be on another part, be a separate console basically. EQ section, and then your mic inputs, and then your meter. But they used to have a strip where there were all these little push buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like this, right? And they would route the signal of that channel to the corresponding track. Not this desk. It had 2 little push buttons and a center console, and you had to go beep, 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 like that to route channel 13 to track 22. And then the ATR 124 also had digital routing. So you had to do this with the, oh man, it was like, wow, okay. And I looked to the patch bay and tried to figure out, because by that time I had never plugged in a TT plug into a patch bay before. I had got that far because I haven't really engineered. I mean, I'd done a little bit and a lot of home engineering on a Porter studio, but nothing real
on that scale.
And then he comes back and he says, right, let's do some acoustic guitar. And he goes out, puts his headphones on, and I'm going, and I'm looking around the console. Okay, monitors, right. Volume, nothing. Right, what? Oh. And I'm looking, I had by that time, I'd seen enough sessions to know the signal path. Microphone, mic gain, patch into a compressor or whatever it was, outboard EQ or something, back into the console, So I was looking around for anything that moved. And I saw this Yuri 1176 doing this. I went, okay. and I looked at the number on it, and I found it on the patch bay, traced the, okay, so he's in mic line 31, right? He's going into number 2, he's coming out. Oh, it's going to channel 13, let's say. My favorite with 13, because actually it's kind of close to you. That's the nice thing about in those days, before we had 64 channel desks, And so I put the fader up, I made sure it was routed, and then, tape machine. Put the tape machine on input, lo and behold, guitar. And he was so patient. He was just playing. He just wanted to see whether he had to put his guitar down, take his headphones on, and walk into the control room and go bang, 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 and then walk back out, which was great. It was a good test. Headphones. Hang on, is he hearing this? Because I didn't even think about the headphones then, and I went and I found out that Mike, and of course he's got a TLM 117 Neumann in front of his acoustic guitar. His voice is going to sound like God through the through the speakers. He said yes. Good. So the headphones are working? Yeah, of course they are. So he'd already, he'd been working because he was used to working in the studio on his own. And I know what that's like because I've done many, many years of that. He had a special foot pedal where he could punch in with he'd take his shoes and socks off and punch in with his toes. He was just done with it. He wanted someone else in the control room, engineering, and being able to be very musical. I want you to drop in on the 8th note after the 3rd beat of this bar, and then out on the beginning of the next bar. something like that. Well, I'm a musician. That's easy.
Yep, so you get it. Yeah.
All I've got to get used to is these rather big buttons. It's not like today where you just have a little keypad or even a mouse.
Right.
These are big industrial type buttons, and you've also got to get used to the delay of the tape going past the erase head, which is when you press that button, the erase head activates, and now you're erasing what was there before, and then the sync head, which is putting the information back on, and they are apart. So at 30 IPS, it's pretty close, but you have to get used to just being tiny little bit in front of the thing, not to chop the first note. But the player also has to be accurate, because if he hits early and you punch in correctly, you're going to chop. He's going to lose the beginning of that first note. And that's why session musicians got to be so good and so accurate at playing, and their time so great, because that's all we had in those days. We didn't get a second chance. So I really owe Mike everything in terms of becoming an engineer. He was my tutor. Yes, I was a pupil tutor. And he taught me so much during those 2 months that we worked together on Crises. And it was wonderful. And that was it. That I could now say I've engineered my first professional sessions as a co-engineer and a co-producer too. So that was really the start of it.
And then, so let's get. I definitely want to make sure we can get to these records, because, like this new Darwin record, which I reviewed maybe a month or so ago, which I was blown away when I put this on, and as well as the Protocol 5, and yeah. I noticed that. So let's talk a little bit about you mix these. This one says it was mixed. And on the back, it says it was also mastered for vinyl. So can you talk a little bit about, so coming from those analog days, a lot of people, especially record collectors, analog is, the holy grail. If it's not analog, a lot of people kind of dismiss it. Well, can you talk to us about the digital, how do you make this sound so good, I guess is the basic question. That's probably probably a complex answer.
Well, let's say, how do we make the sound analog? So, when digital first came in, we were dealing with 16-bit, mainly PCM, at a proprietary sample rate, like the 3M system. I think it was 32 kilohertz. Nobody made a 16-bit converter at that point. So the BBC, which they developed with 3M, they used an 8-bit filter converter with a 4-bit converter, making it 12-bit. I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, because the 3M system was the first time I'd ever recorded digitally. Now, after hearing years of tape hiss and also tape degeneration, which means when you record the song to start with on April the 1st, let's say, and then by the time you've done your 2 weeks of making a record, I'm going back, it didn't used to take that long in those days.
Right.
Overdubs 1 week, mixing, which would be another week maybe. You've now got a month of that tape going by the heads. Well, there's a lot of high frequencies which have actually kind of reduced a little bit because of just tape wear going past the heads. Now, suddenly we had a medium that didn't do that because it was just noughts and crosses, it was just on-off switches, data. Also, the only hiss you heard was the hiss from an amplifier, a mic pre, which we never even got to hear before unless you were monitoring the input of the instrument, which we used to do, in fact, before we ran it through the tape machine. But every time after that, you'd press play and you'd get hiss, right? Hence Dolby, noise reduction. And for the first time, when we were doing an overdub, we couldn't tell when we were being punched in. The other thing was, and this is something they had to figure out, if you'd left the volume up and hit play, you wouldn't know it was playing until the music started. So they then incorporated a fade-in, like the Mitsubishi and the Sony had a fade-in thing. So every time you hit play, it would ramp in, so you had time to grab the master pot and turn it down. Right? There's all these new things. So obviously, it sounded amazing to us. Did it? That's the question. So, and we only really know that now. And then everything went 16-bit. And we then had a kind of standardized 48 kilohertz, 44 1 kilohertz, which frankly is not great. Then we had in the 90s, we then got up to 24-bit, and then we started doing sample increases, sample rate increases, 96 and beyond. To me, two big changes: 24-bit. More dynamic range, 96K. Now, I've done experiments with this and to prove that it really does make a difference. Every time I do a session, which here in my studio, I get a session in 44.1, 48, very rarely in 96. First thing I do is I import all those audio files into a 96K session. Even though once I've recorded the drum kit, I'm going to downsample it to their sample rate because they're locked into it, it makes a difference.
Really?
Damage is done on the way in. And the difference between 48 and 96 in very simple terms is there's this muddiness at around 180 to 240 kilohertz cycles per second. And at 96, it seems to smooth it out just like a piece of tape does. And I've done this experiment quite a few times, and it really works. So I'm a staunch 96 kilohertz user for every project. Now, some people say, well, why don't you use 192? Well, for making a rock and roll album, you've got a lot of different takes. You're trying to do a vocal. You might do 6 or 7 runs of that line. That's a huge amount of disk space. Then it becomes a management problem. And I've always been very conscious of keeping my sessions very clean, keeping my data management on a certain drive so they don't get too large. I even pare them down as from tracking sessions. I then create, once we've got our master take, once I get home or once I'm in here, I will then create a master session. So we've got tracking session of title one. Then I reduce that down to master. So let's say we did 7 takes. I only need 1 take. Now I don't lose the tracking take mix. I keep that and back that up, but I create a new master, which is much smaller. So instead of 27 gigabytes, it suddenly goes down to 5 gigabytes, something like that. It's management, and I think that's very important. And as an engineer, I think you should do that.
Right.
But in terms of making it sound analog, that has nothing to do with the medium you're recording on. It's how you learnt, and it's how you hear. And when you engineer, you make it sound the way you want to hear it. And if it's not sounding the way you want to hear it, that's when you've got to go and fix it. And that's a very personal thing. Elliot Shiner will go, that kick drum. And he'll have a thing about it because it doesn't suit. He wants to hear something out of it, Bruce Botnick, that acoustic guitar. No, it sounds a bit thin. Let's change the mic, to make it sound good to him. So all these engineers, it's how they hear it. And if you grew up with a piece of tape and a console, that's really it. Actually, there is magic. And I call it magic when I watch those guys engineer. Bob Clearmountain, Al Schmidt, Elliot Shiner. I've never worked with Bruce, but I just met him recently. Bill Schnee, Ed Cherney. Loads of engineers. John Punter, probably wouldn't know him as an English engineer. I call it magic, actually, because I watch what they're doing at Nico Bolas, and I go, they're not doing anything, and it sounds amazing. That's the key. All the faders, all in a very, very close proximity to each other. So you're using the biggest part of the fader, where it's the most useful for mixing, right? And not a load of EQ. Just, it's more about mic placement. Al Schmidt, he'd go out, he'd listen to the instrument, whatever the instrument is, and he'd go, okay, put a mic here, put a mic there, and put the fader up, set his gain, bang, done. So a lot of it is background training and coming up in the analog world. That's why you say that album sounds analog to you. That's all it is.
That's like the drums, like you can hear, I call it resonance. It's basically you can hear the sound come off the drums. Yeah. Where on other rock records, it sounds like a thud. Like there's no resonance, there's no depth in a lot of them. And so, getting them to sound like that comes from how you mic it at the outset, making sure that you get a good, clean recording.
Actually, no. That is down to the musician tuning his instrument. Okay. And sadly, we've had this problem for so many years. So many drummers or so many engineers don't like the sound of what a real drum kit sounds like. I've had, even when I was doing sessions in the 70s, I loved high-pitched, ringy tom-toms because they transfer beautifully and are so musical. And I've had engineers that go, wow, I love the way your drums sound. I've had other engineers, your toms are really ringy. And I would go, they are, aren't they? And some engineers would not know what to do with them, especially my bass drum too. I remember a session, the first session I did with Bob Clearmountain was for a Pretenders album, Chrissy Hind. And the producer was Jimmy Iovine and Bob Clearmountain. But Jimmy hadn't arrived yet, and Bob was getting a sound on my drum kit. And he actually didn't realize he'd already mixed my drum kit on another record, what was that? Voices. It'll come. I've lost the artist. I can see his face right now. I can't recall his name. He mixed that album. I said, Bob, you've already mixed this kit. He said, I have? I said, yeah. But he's looking at the kit, double bass drum, all these tom-toms. Of course, once you reduce it, in the analog days, we used to have all the tom-toms to 2 channels. So you don't really know how many tom-toms there really are, unless you really hear each one and go, wow, that's interesting. But you'd have to be, you've probably got too much else to do to really bother to really spot that. and we're getting a drum sound, and I could tell because I've got the headphones on. I'm going, and I could tell Bob's having a bit of trouble with it, whatever the trouble is. Jimmy Iovine, and I can see this is an Air Studio One. I'm set up facing the control room. I can see this guy walk in. I kind of thought, oh, that must be Jimmy. And he stops because I'm playing, and he leans over Bob and hits the talkback, and he goes, "Hey, Simon, great snare drum sound." And Bob looks up, and he still had the talkback on. He said, "Is it?" He said, "Yeah, that's it." And then the talkback went off. And then it was like, okay. Now, and this has happened a few times with the drum kit. I've gone out, done a sound check, and I can tell the engineer's he's just not sure. And he's a good engineer, but he's never heard a drum kit like this before. And I go in, there's the artist, the producer, and I say, okay, play it back. And I listen, I go, sounds great. Yeah, you've got everything there. Maybe just the level of those floor toms, but that sounds great to me. And they go, oh. And they were not convinced. I said, run the track. Let me play the track. So I go up, put my headphones on, and I start playing the track. And we do a take, and I go in, and I say, there you go. And they go, that's amazing. It sounded great. You see? It's the musicality of the instrument. And there's this problem with a lot of modern engineers too. They're so used to hearing a drum go.
Yeah, it sounds terrible.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I mean, I know I'm a drummer, but I'm very concerned about every instrument and the way it sounds. But the drum kit is the only instrument that there's no particular tuning. A guitar, you could do your regular tuning. There's many other different tunings, but those strings have to be in tune, whatever type of tuning. If you've got a low E or an E flat, or even tuned down to a B, which Darwin does all these amazing different tunings, and the bottom string's flapping around like crazy, which produces other problems like rattle in certain positions, so we have to be very careful how we do these, but it produces a great sound. Piano, recording a piano, same thing. Is it even? Are the top notes hitting you like a dart? Is the bottom of the piano sounding muddy? This is all, the sound of the piano to start with, and then your miking technique. But without a good sounding instrument,
it's useless.
You're stuck. It's acoustic guitar. That's one of the hardest things to record because acoustic guitars are so different. What I found is that the quieter acoustic guitars tend to sound better. But now you've got another problem because you've got a guitar player with a microphone here, maybe two, and he's going, and he's got headphones on, so he can't hear, and his foot's going like this, and he moves, and his button on his jacket hits, and you have to go, okay, you need to take your jacket off, you need to take your shoes off if you're going to start, and try to keep the grunting down to a minimum. But this is all, recording, and that's what I love about it. But that's a very quick explanation about, why they sound the way they sound.
So how do you look at the difference between the CD and the vinyl? Because, again, on this Protocol 5, the CD and the vinyl, I think, sound a little bit different. And one of them is mastered for. Can you talk about that? Because not everybody masters a separate master for vinyl and for CD. And I've heard different interviews. So can you talk about that?
Okay, well, that's you see, this is a thing. This is the lack of experience of making or mixing for vinyl. Now, we used to have very strict rules about mixing because of vinyl. For example, you don't want to place a instrument that has a lot of low end, hard left or hard right, because the stylus, the cutting stylus, can crash the groove. Now they have in the cutting machine has cutting lathe actually has some electronics in it. It does have a compressor which does limit the left and right and bring it to the center. It's called I believe it's called an elliptical compressor. Now that might have been just for DMM, which is direct metal mastering, but there's all sorts of rules that you would not do when mixing. Don't place the gong drum. Don't place it hard left. Try not to place your bass drums left and right. First of all, I think it's a very uncomfortable listening experience for the listener to go do 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 like this. It takes away from the music. I used to record both bass drums onto one track, no problem, and it also made sure that there were no mishaps, like erasing the left kick drum because you need a tambourine track. That's happened before, because the kick drum wasn't playing until one little fill where it went diddle-in, and it's gone because there was a tambourine. So there were definitely rules. Once we got to digital, those rules went out the window. We have such hyped and increased bottom end, low end on records now, or on CDs, because we can. The tape machine didn't allow you to do that. You just couldn't do it. The tape would smooth it out. You just couldn't take it. It would slope off down to 20 hertz, and then any third octave. I can't remember the word actually. What we used to transients. Anyway, tape tend to do this both at the top end and the bottom end. It was a lovely medium from that point of view. If you notice, older records don't have a lot of bottom end. If you notice how the basses mix, the bass is actually quite loud, but it's not very bassy. I remember one record I played on, Bill Halverson was the engineer. He was a Wally Hyder engineer from Los Angeles. It was a Jack Bruce album called House Tricks. He put an SM57 on each of my bass drums. Now in England, that's not considered a bass drum mic because it doesn't have a lot of low end.
Right.
He felt that was perfectly adequate for a bass drum sound. And if you listen to the record, I mean, it sounds fine. Everybody does their own thing. Here's the problem. You've done a mix in Pro Tools or Logic or whatever medium, and you have your 2-track master, which hopefully is at 96K, and then you send it to mastering. Well, a CD can have all our mixes now are way higher in level than they used to be because we're not limited to a tape machine, which has to be aligned a certain way. And if you over record, which is what we used to call it, you start, I call it bending the tape. You start getting oh gosh, I can't think of the word. It's distortion basically. Right. So you had to keep within these parameters, gain structure. Well, with a CD, I mean, mixes get higher and higher and higher until the mastering engineer gets a flat line, which he can't do anything to. Basically, he's locked out. So I always give him enough room. I do a mix, which when I send it to the artist, sounds like a record, because if it's too low, then they complain, compared to all my other CDs, I go, yeah, but it's not mastered yet, okay? Two different things. As a mixer, you want good level, but you want the mastering engineer to have some room to work. And let him do the final leveling out of each track. So that's the first thing you have to explain to an artist that doesn't understand that, Secondly, when you're mastering for CD, you can use all this bottom end. As long as it sounds good, as long as it's not, too much. But the vinyl won't work. It just won't sound very good, and your level is going to have to be much lower on the vinyl. Usually it's probably, I think it's about 10 dB lower compared to a CD. It might even be more. Of course, 10 dB depends where we are to start with.
Right.
Are we still running, by the way? You seem to have frozen.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
No, okay.
Right. So that's why I send I send it to the mastering engineer. He masters for 9624 for downloading and streaming. He masters to CD quality, 44:1, 16-bit, and then he'll do a vinyl master. And the vinyl master has to be one continuous piece of, so I'm still doing tape, audio file for each side. So that's why they sound different. I have to say, I have a lovely hi-fi system. the vinyl of Protocol 5, I think sounds better than my mixes. It's
It
the
sounds
same mixes.
fantastic.
It's so weird, how that happens. I think because and that's what I love about mastering. We mix and we spend hours with it, and that's why I have a rule: I never master anything I mix.
And I notice a lot of
I-
people,
I-
most people do that.
oh, good. I'm glad to hear
It
that because
seems
you
like
need.
most people have separate people that makes some people separate that master engineer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great because then, and the fact that it does sound a bit different can be really refreshing. It depends on the mastering, of course.
I know we're running short on time. I could talk to you about this stuff all day,
Oh, I
Simon.
know.
So,
So my answers are a bit long.
oh
I'm sorry.
no, I could talk to you.
We can go on
So
for a little bit longer. We're fine.
okay, this record here is all analog. This
Yeah.
also sounds fantastic. It says that you were the mixing engineer on this. My understanding was that this kind of goes straight down. This is recorded straight down to a analog tape, and then it goes straight. It's cut straight from that. Is that correct?
No,
Is
no,
that-
no. Okay, so it's not. It's we didn't. We recorded this on multi-track. So we had two Studer 827s. So it's 24 tracks each, but we lose a track because of the SMPTE for sync. All the microphones from all the inputs from the band went into an SSL. God, I can't remember what model that was. And then it was routed to tape, but also routed to Pro Tools
Okay.
at the same time. So he records on both medium. And then we once we've recorded everything, then we mix. And I have to remember how we did this. I think what Little did was because he's the engineer of this project. I think then he bounced all the multi-track analog into Pro Tools. So we had two versions. We had the original recording into Pro Tools, separate sessions, but then from analog put it into Pro Tools. I think that's the way we do it. I actually don't quite remember. He might have done it. No, because you'd want to use the repro head on the tape machines and also headphones mix. We would come from Pro Tools. Yeah. Actually, no, we came from the console. Gosh, it's hard to remember because it's a live recording. It's not your normal studio recording. So we do things a little bit
Right.
differently. The tape machine and the Pro Tools are kind of at the end of the chain instead of signal going through the two mediums back into headphones. We're monitoring actually from the console. Then we mixed actually dubbed from the 24 tracks into Pro Tools. We mixed from the Pro Tools. It's just easier to do.
Sure.
But we did mix through the SSL though. So we did some of the moves were automated in Pro Tools. And I guess it's like we would send stems out to the SSL. So it would go through the SSL again, and then out of the SSL onto another piece of analog tape, which I believe was half inch. I think that's what he has. I don't remember what he was. We have so little time that I have to trust him enough. I didn't actually even take much notice of what was going on in the control room because I had to deal with the
Playing.
performance part of it. And if you trust your engineer, and you have to be able to do that. You can't be master of everything,
Right.
otherwise So you deal with it. I can't even remember if we used Dolby or not. I don't think we did. And I think it was 30 IPS. Yeah, it was definitely 30 IPS. You can't mistake the speed of those reels going around. And then he then mastered it for vinyl, specifically for vinyl, and he actually has his own cutting lathe.
So, what is your opinion then on using in the box effects versus external? Or do you use both, or how does that work? Just briefly, or do you prefer?
Yeah, you see, we have again, it's the organizational part of it, and it's also the workflow and the budget too. To do a complete analog mix through a console. Well, first of all, if you were to do a recall, You have to make decisions, and the artist has to make decisions right after you finish mixing that song before you move on to the next song, because you're probably going to change quite a bit. To get that mix back, typically for an SSL recall back in those days, with the patch bay, with all the external outboard equipment, it could take you up to 8 hours. That's a whole day of studio time just to recall a mix, and it will never be exactly the same. So the great thing about Pro Tools and Logic, any of these, although I'm a Pro Tools user, to me, it's an engineering program, not a musician program. That's why I tend to go for it. I can recall a mix in, 1-2 minutes, and it's there. But what I do, I use a little bit of both. I do all my automation in the box, but then I come out of the box in stems. And I go through a machine called an SPL Mix Stream. It's a 16-channel summing box. So I've gone into the analog world, which I don't know. I love it. I did compare before I bought that piece of equipment. I tried 2 other types of summing boxes and in Pro Tools. It's very subtle. I have to be honest. It's very close. And this was in my studio when I had it. And I said, okay, I'm going to sit on the back sofa. So I'm not even in complete line of the speakers anymore. And I said, I want you to switch between the different mediums. We'd somehow rigged it, and I don't remember how we did it, but we somehow rigged it where he could switch between 2 at a time. I think it was something like that. And he would play, and I go, what's that one? He said, whatever that is, mark it down. Don't tell me what it is. And then we play something else, and what's that one? Okay, mark that down. And I didn't know what he was writing down. And then we'd have to repatch for the different between. I think we could do 2 at a time, and then it was like a battle. I can't tell the difference between these 2. Anyway, as it came, I said, okay, which one? He said it was the mix stream every time. I said, wow, really? I said, I got to tell you, it was pretty hard, but there was just something about it that I liked. There you go. That's really all that matters. And then out of the mix stream, it's then summed into stereo, 2 channels. I go into a compressor, stereo compressor. I go out of that into a stereo EQ. And out of that, I go back into Pro Tools. Now, these are analog instruments, especially the compressor and the EQ. And they're not, they are mastering units, but I don't think they were actually built for them. So each pot on them is not indented. They're smooth flowing pots. Now that's tricky. So what I do here, I welcome back the 1K tone into my studio. I align. Every time I recall a mix, I switch off all the any compression that's in the stereo bus. I switch these out, and I send a 1 kilohertz tone at 0, and I have old-fashioned VU meters and PPM, a peak meter, Doro. And I align it, and I make sure I recall this, and of course it's way low. It's usually sets up to be -6 on the meter, but then as soon as I switch my compressor in, which then means I have control over the output, well, inputs as well, but outputs, I can then align to 0, and then I can switch the EQ in. That has adjustment too. I can align. So I know that I'm back to my bass. Now, all analog equipment is not as precise as digital, so when you first switch them on, and then 5 hours later, there might be a slight gain, but they're pretty stable. And so that's how I record my mixes. And then, of course, I flick from input to repro, as I still call it repro, which is the mix that you printed last, and then input is the mix that's happening now. And I go backwards and forwards, and I go, yep, that's almost identical, if not identical. And then I continue with my mix. That's the wonderful thing about the equipment we use today. It's a workflow issue. It's a budget issue too because it's so much quicker.
We still use the. I work in television. We still use the 1K tone in television, bars
Yes,
and tones. So, yes.
I'm not sure. Here's the thing. I don't know. I can't use a studio unless I've got a pair of VU meters and hopefully a peak meter. I just I don't. I mean, yes, I can insert a Pro Tools meter, but I don't know. I'm old fashioned. Maybe I just like to see what's going on,
Get used to
especially
seeing.
for the left and right stuff. A VU is really, really good for that. And it's so accurate too. I mean, one tiny little turn, you breathe on it, and it's suddenly past zero. A peak meter is in segments, so it's going to either flick or not. But the VU might be a little bit, even quarter of a dB down. So to me, it makes all the sense. I don't know how many people even do that these days.
Yeah, right. What I'm curious to know if you're going to put the rest of the. I know the Protocol albums. I think maybe 2 or 3 of them you put on vinyl record. Is there any plans? And you did the box set on CD. Is
Yeah.
there any plans to put all of those back out on record?
Right. So Protocol 5 is the first vinyl that I've produced.
Okay.
Protocol 2 and Protocol 3 went to vinyl from the German company that was licensing those 2 records. They did that on their own. Um, it's expensive to do vinyl, and it takes a while. One of your questions was, how do you decide which plant to use? Frankly, recommendation and the fact that they could do it a lot quicker than most of the American plants that were available. So mine are actually cut in either France or Spain. The company's French. It's one of the largest vinyl producing plants in the world, and it's in Europe. And they were recommended by my distribution company, Alliance. They've dealt with them for many, many records. So I just go directly to them, and my mastering engineer for vinyl is Richard Dodd, who I've known for years. He used to be the engineer at Nova Studios in London in the 70s. He did a lot of recording with ELO, Jeff Lynne. He did the Traveling Wilburys. I mean, his resume is, so long. But he's now a master. He only does mastering now. And Nico Bolas actually was. I didn't even know Richard was what he was doing. Actually, Nico told me. He was a wonderful engineer. Nico. He said, "Oh yeah, no, Richard's great." So I send my mastering to him to do the vinyl. Well, actually, any mastering really. So I know he understands vinyl because he grew up with it, and then I send it all off to the plant in France or Spain, wherever they are, and then they send me like 5 test copies, and I don't even have time to play them all. I mean, so I concentrate on one, and if I hear a problem, then I move to the. And of course, you have to mark. They're white labels. You have to mark them, and sometimes the test copies have little bits of chaff just left in the groove, so you have to clear those out. They're not always pristine like the pressing is. This is a test pressing. But that's basically how it works. And
So will those come out again, or will you be doing those vinyl releases on
well,
the rest
yeah.
of
So
them?
sorry, I digress. So the Protocol 5 was my first try at it, and I wanted to see. It was an experiment to see how it sold. I haven't recouped yet because it's expensive to do, but my next album would be Protocol 4 because
Okay.
people seem to really love that album. That was the album that was nominated for a
Yeah.
Grammy. So yeah,
Yeah.
that one. I want to get that on vinyl, and I'm going to recall all my mixes, listen to them. I probably won't change the mixes because to me, that was then. And I think there's a certain thing about sticking to then. It had a charm, and I don't think it should be messed with. Yeah, that's a whole other
Right.
discussion. recreating what was created already,
Right.
leave it alone.
Yeah, like
We made
everybody.
those decisions at that time,
Yeah,
and they
Jimmy
worked.
Page. Everybody criticized Jimmy Page when he did the re-releases, remixes of the Zeppelin albums,
Right.
and he's still getting flack for that. Everybody in the vinyl community, these suck. He should have left it. Should have never touched it. All this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
One more question, or I'll try to get you out of here with a couple more. Will this come out on Blu-ray? Because I know you guys looks like you filmed it. It's on YouTube. Some of the live. Were you guys going to put a Blu-ray out of this that we can get?
No.
No.
And the reason is because we don't we don't really have a full video.
Oh, all of the whole thing.
Concert. Yeah. Um, it was a hell of a job trying to get the clips that you've seen and the audio synced up, because the audio actually came from the gig that was recorded. So, in other words, we tried to record the gig, but it didn't work. It failed. One camera went down. It wasn't very good. The lighting wasn't very good. So we scrapped that. So we had to find video in order to make promo material. But the audio from that video was not good enough. And we were promoting the record. So I had to sit here with Da Vinci and I didn't even have isolated cams. I just had a live mix of the video, and I had to move things around to make them sync to the music, because we never played that music. That music was played at the club in Ventura, but the video was shot in Yerevan.
Wow. Okay.
So I did most of what I call spotting. You're in TV, so I spotted most of the clips right into the timeline of the audio, but I couldn't extend them because it was the same video as what the next clip was, right? Because it was only a mix. We needed the isolated cameras, and we just couldn't get hold of them. So
Gotcha.
then I sent it to this wonderful video guy in London, who's actually comes from Iceland, and he was able to go through the whole live mix and find little bits to fit those little gaps that we had in the timeline. And so what you see is the audio we never played. We played, I know. So short answer is no, there is no video.
Okay. That's so yeah, yeah. I was wondering that. I was like, no, how come they're not going to put this out? This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
well, I have one question. If I didn't ask, my friends would be upset. So,
Okay.
at work we discussed, who's if Rush was to do a tour, we always talk about okay, Geddy Lee and Alex are going to get back together. I don't know if this will ever happen if they want to do a tour. Is that something that you would be interested in doing? And do you think that would ever be a possibility? It's just a question we know we're like who would do that? Simon Phillips could do that. Mike Portnoy could do that or whatever. Anyways, just kind of a hypothetical question.
Wow. Well, actually, I thought Rush had found somebody.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That's what I thought.
Okay.
But I'm sure I read that somewhere. But that was a few months ago. I'm not really sure what's happening.
I
But
heard they were
I
talking about it. So I was just
yeah,
curious. So that's kind of like one of those water cooler discussions,
yeah. Um, I guess Rush. I mean, I listened to them, but they weren't really on my radar at the time because I was living in England, and Rush were really well known in the States, and not so well known in Britain at that time, I guess. So it wasn't music I was really into, but I did have a couple of Rush albums and liked them. It just, I guess I was into slightly different music. I wasn't really, even though I'm involved in prog rock, I wasn't really a prog rock listener, apart
Okay.
from what I call original prog rock, which was, like Jethro Tull, Gentle Giant, Yes. I mean, I loved all that, absolutely loved all that. But it kind of changed, and it got very. I thought a lot of the soul went out of it, the groove, the feel went out of it. It got very
Yeah, yeah.
um, precise, mechanical, and stiff. And to me, and the music I play has a lot of odd meter stuff,
Yes.
but it doesn't make any sense unless it feels good. Exactly. Yeah. It's got to feel great, you know? And that was always my thing. And I felt that prog rock was forgetting about groove and about feel and it got just too mechanical for me. So I kind of stopped really listening to it.
Right. All right, Simon. Well, I appreciate you doing this interview, and I'd love to talk to you. There's so many things I could talk to you about these different albums. These are other ones that would be fantastic
Well,
for
a
vinyl.
very quick,
All of
quick
these.
mention of the Hiromi albums. So the one big thing about how they sound is that they were recorded on a DSD system, direct streaming, uh, 1 bit or 2 bit. It's not a PCM system. It's a totally different
Oh, interesting.
form of digital. Remember SACD,
Right.
right? It's that form, but in multi-track.
Okay.
Very high quality digital, probably the best digital you can use.
So it's better than
To,
PCM because
huh?
everybody says PCM is the gold standard. This is
PCM,
actually,
yeah.
but this is.
That's what. Yeah, it's cheap. It's there's so much of it now. It's cheap to use.
I
It's
got you.
cheap to produce and everything. DSD is totally different, and the systems are quite expensive. They only work on a PC. It's called Sonoma, but there were a couple of other versions. Phillips had one, and I used it in Belgium in Mulde, Galaxy Studios. I don't remember what that was called. It was a Phillips version of it. They're limited. I think it's limited to 24 tracks, maybe 32. I don't quite remember. Editing on it is a nightmare. Um, but the sound the
Very
depth is beautiful. Even if you were to record 24-bit, or even 32 floating at 192, it won't sound like Sonoma because the filters are so different, the way it works. Um, it's it's really meant for classical music. It's meant for music that's played all together, no overdubs. I mean, you can overdub if you've got enough spare
right.
channels left. But it's really music that's played live, and all the Hiromi music was played live. I don't think we ever did an overdub. There were a couple of punch-ins here and there, not many though, because it was kind of tricky to do with that kind of music.
Right.
Um, and But it is a beautiful recording medium. I wish I could use it more in various projects, but you have to have someone that actually has the system, and also it's PC, which I'm not. Ooh, yeah.
Not, yeah.
Anyway,
What about upcoming projects? Anything on the burner here coming up? Any new
I've
records?
just finished mixing the next Darwin album.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
I just sent it to Richard Dodd to be mastered,
Really
and that will be coming out next year.
awesome. I'll be sure to get that one. I can't
Yeah.
wait.
And we have another one in the can too. So we're really going for it. So at some point, I've got to write music for another Protocol album, but I just need time to do
Yeah,
that.
you're a busy guy. I appreciate you joining me. I really do.
Pleasure.
It was a pleasure talking to you. And again, I could go on for hours. So thank you.
Right. Lovely, lovely, lovely.